welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the top 10 checkmate patterns. Patterns in chess is a series of how one can learn patterns while playing chess and solving puzzles in chess. Let's get started. The basic assumption here is that you already know what a checkmate is. If not, I would strongly suggest that you first learn that, understand what a checkmate is. But to briefly give you an idea, a checkmate is where you attack the opponent king in such a way that the king can't escape. There's no other option but to surrender and resign from the game, or the game ends because of a checkmate. Now, these checkmates are very common. They come across in different situations in different games. However, the pattern, the underlying pattern is always the same, and that is what I want to be able to explain to you today. Okay, the very first checkmate pattern is called BRM, or back rank mate. This is the most common one. Now, for every checkmate, I look at it in terms of two different things. One, what are the conditions that make it a particular pattern? Like in this case, what are the conditions that need to be satisfied for it to be called a back rank mate? And the second one is the elements. So let's come to the elements a little later. First, let's focus on the conditions. So what makes a particular checkmate a back rank mate? So the first condition is that the opponent king needs to be on the edge of the board. So it could be edge or corner, doesn't matter, but he needs to be in the edge of the board. He can't be in the middle. Second, a rook-like attacker along the edge. So somebody has to give a check. That's the attacker for me. He's the one who's giving the check. He's the attacker. Why I say it's rook-like is because it could be rook or queen, or tomorrow if chess invents some other new kind of piece which is called a commander, which is a rook and a knight combined, even that can do the checkmate, because the idea is a horizontal or a vertical check. The escape squares, by nature of the king being on the edge of the board, there's always going to be some escape squares. In this case, in the puzzle that you're seeing, the escape squares are 3, which is f7, g7 and h7, and they are blocked. So what are the elements of a checkmate? Now, every checkmate is going to have 3 things. There's going to be an attacker, there's going to be a supporter who would be supporting the attacker, and there'd be a controller, somebody who is controlling all the escape squares. So in this particular puzzle, rook is the attacker. There is no supporter needed because the rook is giving a distant check, not a close check. And the controller is basically the 3 pawns in front of the king, which is the blocking pawns, the blockers. This could be replaced very well if the king were to be on g6 and the pawns are not there. That would also be constituting a back rank mate. Let's go to the second one. The second one is called hug of death. The conditions first. The opponent king needs to be on the edge of the board. When I say edge, it's edge and corner. There has to be a smothering queen right in the face. This is a very close check. It's not a distant check like the previous one. The queen is giving the check right next to the king, which means the queen by itself can't do it and he needs support. The support here is being given by the king. So 3 elements or 3 conditions that you need is king needs to be on the edge of the board, queen needs to be right next to the king, literally smothering him, face off, right? And then the queen needs to be supported. So these are the 3 elements needed here. So the attacker is the queen, the supporter is the white king supporting the white queen, and you don't need a controller because the queen itself does the job of both attacking and controlling. So the checkmate is very simple because you just need a queen and a king together, and that's why it's so very common to come across this particular checkmate. Okay, the next one is called the fishtail checkmate. So what are the conditions needed for fishtail? 1, the opponent king needs to be in the middle. He can't be on the edge. If he were to be on the edge, it's probably going to turn into a HOD of some sort. He needs to be in the middle, so the red color box that I've drawn is to indicate what I consider to be the middle of the chessboard. There needs to be a diagonal queen attack, not any other type, a diagonal queen attack. And whenever the queen attacks the king diagonally, there will always be 2 blind spots for the queen. Those are called the knight squares, because that's the 2 squares a knight would have been able to attack. So those 2 squares are marked in red. So if the king were to give if the white queen were to give a check to the black king, then those are the 2 squares, the 2 red squares that have been marked would be the place where the king would escape to. And those escape squares are right now being controlled by the bishop on h3, and therefore it is a checkmate. At the same time, you also need a support for the queen, which is being delivered by the king on c4. So what are the elements of this checkmate? The attacker is the queen, the supporter is the king, and the controller is the bishop. But it need not be the bishop, it could also be a rook, it could also be a knight, it could also be another queen. Next is the swallowtail. It's very similar to the fishtail. The swallowtail is where the check is not diagonal anymore, it's a non-diagonal check. Why I'm saying it's non-diagonal is it could be because the king and queen are both on the same file, or the king and queen are both on the same rank. It doesn't matter, but wherever the queen is, there's always going to be two blind spots for the queen where the king can potentially escape to. These are called the knight squares because, again, those are the two squares a knight on b5 would have happily been controlling. But since the queen is not a knight, he can't do that. And therefore, somebody else needs to control it. In this case, that is the bishop. So with all the conditions being met, the elements here are the attacker is the queen, the supporter is the king, and the controller is the bishop. You could also have a different controller, like a rook on h7. Absolutely fine. You could also have maybe not a knight, but multiple pieces, maybe a different queen also controlling those two squares, and that would absolutely be a swallowtail mate. The next one is a smothered mate, very common in many games, especially with beginners and intermediate level, where the king is super protected, nobody can give a check to him except the knight. So the king is so protected that it's for his own worst possibility that he would ever want to think about. So in this case, what are the conditions? The opponent king needs to be in the corner. There are exceptions to this, but let's assume that. Let's keep it simple right now. So he needs to be in the corner. The knight is the one delivering the check, and opponent has blockers all around the king. So he's well protected to an extreme extent. So let's break down the elements. You need an attacker, that's the knight. You need a supporter, that's not needed in this case. The knight is completely fine by himself. And you need controllers. In this case, you don't need controllers, you need blockers. The next common checkmate pattern is the rook roller. The rook roller is very similar to a back rank mate because the escape squares are controlled by another rook in this case. So it's common because of in the play of game, you would come across this particular situation where somebody can use these two rooks and roll them across, a terminology that you learn as you learn this particular checkmate. So opponent king needs to be on the edge, rook-like attacker on the edge, another rook-like controller to control the escape squares. So the attacker here is a rook at a8, the controller here is rook at d7, and the supporter is not needed because these are long-term checks, long-distance checks. The next one is a Morphy mate, named after Paul Morphy. The opponent king is in the corner, bishop-like attacker along the edge, bishop-like because you could have a queen or any other fictional piece, maybe a knight and a bishop put together. Let's call it the general, right? It doesn't matter. So as long as a bishop-like check, a diagonal check is there, and another piece which is kind of like the rook controlling the escape squares. And of course you need a blocker because without the blocker on h7, the king can escape that. The next checkmate is the Boden's mate. This is using two different bishops. They kind of crisscross like a scissor. So the conditions here is that the opponent king needs to be on the edge, bishop-like attacker along the edge, okay, which is giving a check, and another bishop-like controller that controls the escape squares. You also need the blockers, which is the rook and the pawn, which is going to block the path for the king. So in this case, the attacker is a bishop on a6 and the controller is a bishop on g3. The Arabian or the Scorpion mate. In this, the knight is kind of diagonally away from the king, controlling the two adjacent squares, g8 and h7. The rook delivers the check. So the opponent king is in the corner, the rook is in the face, it's a close check. Knight supports the rook and the controlling square. So the elements here is attacker is rook, supporter is knight, and the controller is also knight. Now, those are kind of simple, but that's how those checks form the basis to form something more complicated. So here's one complicated checkmate, which is the hook's mate. Now let's pay attention. So what are the conditions needed? So you need the king to be in the middle, inside the red box. The rook needs to attack right in the face, usually behind the king. And the knight needs to support the rook and one of the controlling escape squares, which is d7 in this case. And there has to be support for the knight because the knight is really in right next to the king, so he could get captured. So therefore, the pawn plays the role of supporting the knight as well as controlling d6. And finally, you need a pawn, a black pawn f7 for it to be a blocker. So there are quite a few conditions necessary for something to be called hook's mate. In this case, the attacker is the rook, the supporter is the knight, and the controller is both the pawn and the knight. So as you can see, the basic checkmates evolve to become more complicated and they create more complex patterns. Now, it's not so important that you remember the names of these patterns as much as you recognize these patterns. You can call it any which way you want. Like I call a particular mate Scorpion mate, and the general terminology is an Arabian mate. It doesn't matter, but as long as you can recognize it and as long as you can see that that forms the basic elements on which the other is built, that's how you learn pattern recognition from chess. So what are the next steps to leverage patterns? Learn chess, as it makes you really, really good at pattern recognition. So that is something that you want to start off right away. Try to classify any checkmate you come across and see if they fall into this top 10. Follow this channel, subscribe and click on the bell icon so that you can see more insightful videos on checkmate patterns and pattern recognition skills in general. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much.